July 26, 2018. The sky above Shasta County does not look like a sky at all. It is a churning ceiling of charcoal, amber, and bruised violet, illuminated from below by a wall of flame that stretches beyond the horizon. The air vibrates, not with wind, but with pressure. A low, grinding hum rolls through the canyons, sounding less like weather and more like machinery tearing through the earth. Then, the clouds descend. Not rain, not lightning. A column. A rotating, vertical river of fire and ash, pulling itself upward from the burning ground, twisting into a funnel that stretches 18,000 feet into the atmosphere. Inside it, temperatures approach 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind speeds climb to 143 miles per hour. Trees are stripped bare in seconds. Steel transmission towers buckle. A steel pipe is found coiled around. An oak-like ribbon. This is not a wildfire behaving unusually. This is a tornado born from combustion, and it is moving toward a city of 90,000 people. Before this night, the United States had never documented a true fire tornado on American soil. Meteorologists had theorized about them. Historians had noted brief, unverified accounts from Australia and Japan. But no radar had ever captured one. No agency had a protocol for it. No firefighter had been trained to recognize its approach. On this evening, in the foothills west of Redding, California, the atmosphere did something it had only done once before in recorded human history. It took a wildfire, fed it the perfect combination of heat, drought, wind shear, and topography, and watched it build a storm. This is not a story about a fire that got out of control. This is a story about a landscape that reached its breaking point, a weather system that refused to behave, and the men and women who stood between a natural disaster and the impossible. To understand how a flame can learn to rotate, you must first understand what was burning, and you must go back 3 days before the sky tore open. Northern California's Sacramento Valley is a geological bowl, cradled between the coastal range to the west and the Sierra Nevada to the east. For much of the year, cool Pacific air rolls in, deposits moisture, and retreats. But by midsummer, that pattern inverts. As air masses cross the mountains and descend into the valley, they compress. Compression generates heat. The air sheds its humidity. What reaches the valley floor is no longer a breeze. It is a furnace. The summer of 2018 did not begin with a spark. It began with a cycle. From 2012 to 2016, California endured one of the most severe droughts in its modern history. Rivers shrank, reservoirs cracked, soil turned to dust. Then, in early 2017, a wet winter arrived. Rain returned. Snowpack rebounded. The parched earth responded with a biological explosion. Grasses shot upward. Brush thickened. Chaparral reclaimed slopes that had been barren for half a decade. It was nature's attempt to heal. But in a fire-prone ecosystem, abundance is a double-edged sword. By 2018, the wet years were a memory. The drought had returned, but it found a landscape loaded with fuel. Every blade of grass, every dried shrub, every fallen branch from the previous winter's storms was now cured by relentless sun. The hillsides around Redding were not just dry, they were chemically primed. Moisture content in dead vegetation dropped below 5%. At that threshold, ignition requires almost no energy. A single ember, a spark from metal on asphalt, a dropped cigarette, can transition from spark to crown fire in under 30 seconds. Then came the heat. A high pressure ridge anchored itself over the western United States, a classic summer setup that meteorologists call a heat dome. Temperatures in Redding climbed past 110 degrees Fahrenheit for days. On July 26th, the mercury hit 113. The air was so desiccated that it actively pulled moisture from living trees. Bark cracked, leaves curled. The atmosphere itself was doing half the fire's work before a single flame appeared. The valley was no longer a landscape. It was a loaded chamber. All it needed was a trigger. Weather does not announce its intentions. It simply changes. On the afternoon of July 26th, a powerful low-pressure system pushed down from the Pacific Northwest, colliding with the high-pressure ridge parked over California. The pressure gradient tightened. Winds accelerated. But these were not the gentle afternoon breezes that firefighters expect. These were katabatic winds, channeled through the mountain passes, compressing as they descended, heating as they fell, and striking the Carr fire from the west with sustained gusts exceeding 50 miles per hour. At approximately 5:30 p.m., the fire's character fundamentally changed. It transitioned from a fuel-driven fire, where vegetation and topography dictate movement, to a wind-driven fire, where the atmosphere becomes the engine. Wind-driven fires do not burn. They sprint. They do not spread. They leap. The flames flattened, racing downhill at terrifying velocity. Within 4 hours, the fire advanced 3 miles eastward. It approached the Sacramento River, and then it did the unthinkable. It jumped. Embers, lifted by the updraft, carried miles ahead of the main front, igniting spot fires on the opposite bank. The river, once a barrier, became a backdrop. The fire was no longer confined to the hills. It was entering the western suburbs of Reading. Evacuation orders were issued to 38,000 residents. Roads clogged. Panic spread. Families packed vehicles with minutes to spare. Some fled on foot. Others waited too long, watching smoke roll over ridgelines like a tidal wave. In the Lake Keswick Estates neighborhood, a resident named Zita Bila received her evacuation notice only after flames became visible. Her street had one exit. It was gridlocked. She sat in her car with her children, feeling the heat radiate through the glass, watching orange light consume the trees behind them. They escaped. Barely. Miles north, contract dozer operator Don Smith was cutting a fire line above Spring Creek Reservoir when the wind shifted. His crew chief radioed repeatedly. 2 firefighters tried to reach him on foot. The heat forced them back. Helicopters dropped water through zero visibility smoke. 1 pilot's temperature warning light activated. The aircraft landed. Don Smith and his open cab dozer vanished into the smoke. No one knew it yet, but the fire was no longer just burning. It was breathing, and the atmosphere was beginning to inhale. The base of the tornado measured 1,000 feet across. It carved a path through the landscape, moving eastward at roughly 20 miles per hour. Inside the column, winds reached 143 miles per hour. The temperature approached 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. At that heat, steel softens, aluminum melts, glass vaporizes. The damage it left behind was not consistent with wildfire behavior. It was consistent with violent atmospheric rotation. Trees were debarked, not burned, stripped. The bark was peeled away in long, spiraling ribbons, exposing pale wood beneath. The ground was scoured. Topsoil was ripped from the earth, leaving bare patches identical to those left by F3 and F4 tornadoes in the Midwest. A massive electrical transmission tower, engineered to withstand hurricane-force winds and ice loads, collapsed like a snapped pencil. A heavy steel pipe was found wrapped around a living oak tree, bent and fused by heat and force. Homes that had not yet been touched by flame lost their roofs. Walls blew inward. Debris flew horizontally, embedding itself in surviving structures. 3. Bulldozer operators, Don Andrews, Terry Cummings, and Jimmy Jones, were working a fire line when the vortex swept over them. In an instant, the wind pressure shattered every window. Rocks, burning branches, and superheated embers bombarded their cabs. They survived by hunkering down, shielding their faces, and enduring 30 seconds of atmospheric violence that felt like an eternity. When the wind passed, they emerged into a landscape that had been rearranged. Less than a mile away, a different story was unfolding. Jeremy Stoke was 37 years old. He was a fire prevention inspector for the Reading Fire Department, not a line firefighter, not an incident commander. His role that evening was community protection, driving through neighborhoods, knocking on doors, ensuring residents had evacuated. When the Carr fire ignited on July 23rd, Jeremy had been on vacation. He cut it short. He returned to duty on July 26 as the fire jumped the river and the sky began to rotate. He was already on Buenaventura Boulevard. At 7:39 p.m., Jeremy radioed a mayday. He reported his location. He requested a water drop. He stated he was being burned over. The transmission cut off. There was no response. The official CAL FIRE investigation later concluded that Jeremy Stoke suffered fatal traumatic injuries when entrapped by the fire tornado while conducting evacuation operations. He was the first firefighter in documented history to lose his life to a fire tornado. He was found in the early hours of July 27. His colleagues remembered him as a man who believed his job was not to fight fire, but to protect people from it. His final act was driving toward danger to ensure his neighbors had escaped. They had. He had not. Don Smith's bulldozer was located hours later by aerial reconnaissance. It had been completely consumed. No fire shelter was deployed. No remains were recovered. He was confirmed deceased. Miles away, in a residential subdivision north of the main fire front, the tornado's outer wind field swept over a home where 70-year-old Melody Bledsoe had been unable to evacuate in time. She called her husband Ed as the vortex passed overhead. Those were among her last words. When Ed returned, the house was gone. Melody and her 2 young great-grandchildren perished. The fire tornado remained on the ground for approximately 30 minutes. By 8 p.m., it dissipated. But in that half hour, it claimed 4 lives, altered firefighting doctrine forever, and proved that fire and atmosphere could merge into a single unstoppable force. The Carr fire continued burning for 5 more weeks. It consumed 229,651 acres. It destroyed 1,604 structures. It caused over $1.6 billion in damage. 8 people died in total. Half of the historic town of French Gulch was reduced to ash. Nearly every home in Keswick was lost. Entire neighborhoods in Reading were erased. The fire was finally contained on August 30th, 2018. But the true legacy of July 26 was not measured in acres or dollars. It was measured in data. Within months, atmospheric scientists and wildfire researchers published a landmark study in Geophysical Research Letters. Using radar archives, satellite imagery, and ground damage surveys, they reconstructed the fire tornado's formation. The findings were clear. The vortex did not form from chaotic fire behavior. It formed through the same physical mechanisms that produce conventional tornadoes. The Pyrocumulonimbus updraft acted as the mesocyclone. Wind shear provided the horizontal rotation. Vertical stretching organized the vortex. The damage path, debarked trees, ground scouring, and structural failure patterns all matched EF3 tornado criteria. More importantly, the study revealed that radar had detected the vortex before it touched down. Velocity couplets, rotational signatures, and sudden updraft intensification were visible on weather and wildfire monitoring systems. The technology to warn of a fire tornado already existed. The protocols did not. In response, CAL FIRE, the National Weather Service, and the USDA Forest Service revised their training manuals. Fire behavior courses now include modules on Pyrocumulonimbus development, wind shear recognition, and vortex warning indicators. Incident commanders are trained to recognize when a fire is transitioning from ground-driven to atmosphere-driven. Evacuation zones are expanded earlier when Pyro-CB potential rises. Radar operators monitor wildfire plumes with the same urgency as severe thunderstorm cells. Jeremy Stoke's name is now cited in wildland firefighter academies across the American West. Not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder of the unseen dangers that emerge when fire meets atmosphere. The lesson is no longer just about reading wind or respecting terrain. It is about understanding that a fire can become weather, and weather does not negotiate. The conditions that birthed the Reading fire tornado were not anomalies, they were accelerants. Climate models have long predicted that prolonged droughts, followed by wet winters, followed by extreme heat waves, would increase the frequency of high-intensity fire weather across the western United States. The fuel load, the atmospheric instability, the topographic wind channels, the drying vegetation, all of these are not disappearing. They are compounding. Firefighters know how to read a fire. They know how to anchor a line, when to retreat, how to use terrain to their advantage. But until July 26, 2018, no one taught them how to survive a storm made of flame. Today, they are taught to watch the sky as closely as the ground. They are trained to recognize when heat release is exceeding atmospheric capacity. They are warned that when a fire begins to generate its own cloud, it is no longer a land event. It is an atmospheric event. The Reading fire tornado was not a fluke. It was a milestone. It proved that the boundary between wildfire and severe weather is thinner than previously understood. It demonstrated that radar, if monitored correctly, can provide advance warning. It showed that evacuation protocols must account for atmospheric violence, not just flame spread. And it reminded everyone that the most dangerous moments in a wildfire are not when the fire is largest, but when it stops behaving like fire and starts behaving like weather. Climate change is not a distant threat. It is a present multiplier. It extends fire seasons. It dries vegetation faster. It intensifies heat domes. It increases the likelihood of pyro-CB formation. The American West will see more fires. It will see more extreme behavior. It may see more fire tornadoes. But it will not be caught unprepared again. The data exists. The training exists. The awareness exists. What remains is vigilance. July 26, 2018 began like any other summer day in Northern California. It ended with a sky that tore itself open, a fire that learned to rotate, a storm that rained ash instead of water, and a landscape that reminded humanity of a simple, humbling truth. Nature does not follow human categories. Fire is not just combustion. Wind is not just movement. Heat is not just temperature. When they align, they become something else, something ancient, something indifferent, something powerful enough to rewrite what we thought we knew. The Carr fire tornado lasted 30 minutes, but its shadow stretches across wildfire science, emergency response, climate research, and the memory of those who stood in its path. Jeremy Stoke, Don Smith, Melody Bledsoe, her great-grandchildren, the families who lost everything, the crews who fought when the sky turned against them. Their names are not footnotes. They are the foundation of a new understanding. We cannot stop fires. We cannot control the atmosphere. We cannot erase drought or dismantle heat domes, but we can study them. We can prepare for them. We can listen to the data. We can train for the impossible. And we can remember that when the air grows still, when the smoke climbs too high, when the wind shifts without warning, the fire may not be the only thing you need to fear. The sky is watching, and sometimes it breathes back.